In recent months, Western countries have been increasing their actions against a so-called shadow fleet of tankers attempting to evade sanctions on Russian oil and gas. European countries have seized 9 such vessels. Now, some Russian commercial ships appear to be arming themselves to avoid being boarded. These photos, released by Estonia, appear to show machine guns and sandbag barriers mounted on a Russia-flagged vessel carrying liquefied gas in the Baltic Sea. Armed commercial ships are common in piracy hotspots, but not in the Baltic. The Estonian Navy says Russia had also increased its military presence in international waters in the Baltic. Let's get more from our Russia bureau chief, Juri Rescheto, who's been operating from the Latvian capital since DW was banned from reporting from Russia. Welcome, Juri. Help us understand how seriously European governments are taking enforcing these sanctions. Does the presence of guns on these rusting tankers mean the various navies out there enforcing these bans then do not stop these shadow fleet ships?
Well, I think, Phil, this is really more about the symbolic message, and that message is pretty clear. Russia's shadow fleet is enormously important to Putin and to financing the war. I would even say it's critical, and Moscow wants to protect those ships at all costs. The question is whether these weapons we've seen on board are actually capable of taking on NATO warships that are patrolling the Baltic Sea. I've been on the Estonian naval vessels twice, not a patrol boat, but a proper warship, and frankly, they seem a lot more heavily armed than a ship carrying a machine gun, a Russian one. That's why I think we are mainly looking at a symbolic gesture here. At the same time, if a Russian vessel were to open fire with one of these weapons on a NATO ship, that could potentially be seen as an act of war.
And is that what's going on? Is Russia daring Western governments to see who blinks first?
I think Russia's leadership has been engaged in what many describe as a hybrid war against the West for years. The Shadow Fleet is one of the most important elements of that strategy. The concern is that these are often old, poorly maintained and unassured vessels. If one of them were to suffer a serious accident, the Baltic Sea could face a major environmental disaster, and the challenging doesn't stop at sea. Russia has been testing Western countries, yes, through a whole range of hybrid tactics: espionage, disinformation campaigns, sabotage of undersea infrastructure, and now increasingly visible displays of force involving armed Shadow Fleet vessels.
So I mentioned in the introduction that the European naval vessels have seized 9 of these Russian Shadow Fleet ships. This doesn't sound like a lot, is it?
Well, look, the problem for authorities is that you can't simply board or seize a ship operating international waters. There have been 2 very specific legal grounds. For example, if a captain observes suspicious behavior, a vessel suddenly making sharp course changes, sailing suspiciously, operating in an unusual manner, dragging an anchor when it shouldn't, where it shouldn't, or causing an oil spill. The legal thresholds are high, and that's exactly where the dilemma lies. Any decision to detain vessel has significant political implications and generally requires also coordination with national governments. And within the European Union, governments don't all see the threat in the same way. What appears highly alarming to Estonia in the Baltic Sea may seem much less urgent to Portugal on the Atlantic coast. Reacting a common position is often easier said than done, Phil.
Right. So what sort of, you mentioned how important these oil exports are to Russia. What sort of effect have these Western sanctions and their enforcement actually had on Russian oil exports?
Well, I think one thing is clear. The Shadow Fleet has helped Russia earn enormous sums despite Western sanctions by redirecting oil exports to countries such as China and India and using this fleet to move that oil, Moscow has continued generating substantial revenue throughout the war. In that sense, many would argue that sanctions alone have had limited impact. The measures that appeared to make a bigger difference, I would say, were secondary sanctions targeting those who continued facilitating Russian oil trade. That put additional pressure on the system and affected export volumes. But what may be having an even greater impact inside Russia right now are the Ukrainian drone strikes targeting energy objects, energy infrastructure on almost daily basis within Russia.
Thanks, Juri. Juri Rescheto in Riga.